started with something so ordinary, so harmless. A small white capsule, the kind you might take on a late night after a long day of work. The kind you give your child when they complain of a sore throat. The kind sitting in nearly every American medicine cabinet in the 1980s. No one could have imagined that inside those familiar red and blue Tylenol capsules lurked death. Quick, silent, invisible. In September of 1982, 7 innocent people in the Chicago area swallowed what they believed was safe medicine. And within hours, their lives were over. The nation would never look at over-the-counter drugs the same way again. Before we dive into this chilling story, make sure you like and subscribe, because every week, we'll uncover true crime cases that are as shocking as they are unforgettable. Now, let's begin. September 29, 1982. The Kellerman family of Elk Grove Village, Illinois, woke up to what seemed like a normal school day. 12-year-old Mary Kellerman complained of a sore throat. Her father handed her a single extra-strength Tylenol capsule and sent her back to bed. Minutes later, he heard a crash. Racing upstairs, he found his little girl collapsed on the bathroom floor. She wasn't breathing. By the time doctors could see her, Mary was already gone. At the time, doctors were baffled. A healthy 12-year-old girl, dead without explanation. But Mary wasn't the only one. That same morning, 27-year-old postal worker Adam Janis also reached for Tylenol after complaining of chest pains. He swallowed 2 capsules. Hours later, he too collapsed and died suddenly. Grieving relatives gathered at his home that afternoon. In their sorrow, 2 of Adam's family members, his brother Stanley and Stanley's wife Teresa, also reached for the same Tylenol bottle. Within hours, both were dead. 1 bottle, 3 lives. Family destroyed. And this was only the beginning. In the hours that followed, panic began to spread. News reports linked the sudden deaths. All the victims had taken extra-strength Tylenol capsules. Tests confirmed the unthinkable. Someone had laced random bottles of Tylenol with potassium cyanide, a lethal poison that shuts down the body in minutes. The capsules were indistinguishable from safe ones. There was no smell, no warning. Just a quick, agonizing death. The horror was made worse by its randomness. No one was safe. The victims weren't connected. They had no enemies, no reason to be targeted. The killer wasn't going after people, the killer was going after the medicine itself. The city of Chicago fell into hysteria. Police cars drove through neighborhoods blaring warnings over loudspeakers. Do not take Tylenol. Destroy it immediately. Pharmacies stripped shelves bare. Hospitals were overwhelmed with people terrified they'd been poisoned. Parents dumped medicine bottles into garbage cans. One single product, trusted, familiar, had become the nation's biggest fear. For Johnson & Johnson, the makers of Tylenol, this was a nightmare beyond comprehension. Their best-selling drug, the most trusted brand in America, was now a weapon. Within days, 31 million bottles of Tylenol were pulled from shelves nationwide, costing the company over $100 million. But it wasn't just about money. It was about survival. Could America ever trust Tylenol again? In a bold move, Johnson & Johnson introduced tamper-evident packaging, safety seals, child-proof caps, foil wrappers, the kind we see on every medicine bottle today. These changes would revolutionize consumer safety forever. But even as packaging evolved, one terrifying truth remained. The killer was still out there. Investigators raced against time. The FBI interviewed hundreds of people. They searched pharmacies and warehouses. And then, a chilling letter surfaced. It was sent directly to Johnson & Johnson. The writer demanded $1 million or more people would die. The letter was signed by a man named James William Lewis. He was arrested. His handwriting matched. His criminal history was suspicious. He seemed to know details about the poisonings. But here's the catch. Lewis was living in New York at the time. He had no access to Chicago pharmacies. He couldn't have been the one placing poison bottles back on shelves. So if not him, then who? For months, fear lingered. Copycat crimes emerged across the country. Capsules tampered with in different cities, people poisoned in similar ways. But none matched the original Chicago killings. None had the same precision, the same cold calculation. The Tylenol killer seemed to vanish into thin air, leaving only fear, heartbreak, and suspicion behind. For the families of the victims, grief turned to rage. They had lost children, siblings, spouses, all because they trusted a simple bottle of medicine. Every time a new theory emerged, hope would rise, only to be crushed again when evidence fell apart. Years passed, investigations slowed, leads dried up, and still the questions haunted everyone. Why those bottles? Why those victims? And above all, who could commit such a senseless act? The Tylenol murders remain one of the most infamous unsolved crimes in American history. Over 4 decades later, no one has ever been charged with the killings. But the story doesn't end there, because in recent years, new evidence has surfaced. Hidden files, potential DNA traces, and whispers that the truth may have been closer than anyone realized. Could the killer have been hiding in plain sight all along? The Tylenol killings shocked America. 7 innocent people gone, poisoned by the very medicine they trusted most. Johnson & Johnson had recalled millions of bottles. Pharmacies had cleared their shelves. The nation had changed forever. And yet, the killer remained free. The cyanide-laced capsules had struck like lightning, fast, deadly, and vanishing just as quickly. Investigators were left scrambling through shattered lives, shattered families, and shattered trust, desperate to piece together a puzzle with too many missing pieces. This was no longer just about solving a crime. It was about restoring faith in the safety of everyday life. In the weeks following the murders, the ransom letter had put a spotlight on James William Lewis. He was intelligent, manipulative, and cold. His demand for $1 million suggested arrogance or desperation. But here was the problem. Lewis was in New York when the deaths occurred. He had no access to the Chicago area pharmacies. If he was behind the letter, then perhaps he was only an opportunist, exploiting national panic for his own gain. Still, detectives couldn't look away from him. Lewis's past was littered with fraud schemes, financial crimes, and accusations. He fit the profile of a man capable of cruelty. But the physical act of walking into stores, tampering with bottles, and returning them undetected, that was another matter. The evidence against Lewis was circumstantial, thin, frustrating. He was convicted of extortion but never charged with the murders themselves. If not him, then who? Investigators began to consider another possibility. Maybe the killer wasn't just an opportunist. Maybe he was someone with inside knowledge of how products moved, someone who understood the supply chain. Theories emerged. A rogue employee at a distribution center, a worker at the Tylenol factory, a pharmacist with access to shipments. But all searches led to dead ends. No fingerprints, no surveillance footage, no clear witnesses. The killer had managed to poison bottles without leaving a single trail. It was almost surgical, almost professional, and that raised a darker possibility. Maybe the murders were not random at all. As fear spread, so did imitation. Across the country, scattered cases of product tampering appeared. Bottles of soda, baby food, even other medications. Most were hoaxes. Some were tragic. But none were as coordinated or as devastating as the Tylenol murders. For investigators, this flood of false leads became a nightmare. Every copycat blurred the trail. Every hoax consumed time and resources. The original killer had not only taken lives, they had unleashed chaos nationwide. And in that chaos, the truth slipped further away. While detectives drowned in dead ends, the families of the victims carried scars that time would never heal. Mary Kellerman's parents, who had given their daughter a capsule to ease her sore throat, lived with guilt that was never theirs to bear. The Janus family, who had lost 3 loved ones in a single day, became a haunting reminder of how quickly life could collapse. Their grief turned to anger. How could someone commit such a crime and simply disappear? How could 7 murders in plain sight lead to nothing but silence? And beneath that silence lay the question no one wanted to ask out loud. What if the killer was still out there, watching, waiting? Months turned to years. Leads dried up. The case grew colder with every passing day. Detectives retired. Evidence was boxed away. the Tylenol murders drifted into the realm of urban legend, a story parents whispered to their children about why medicine bottles had seals. But for those who had lived it, the fear never left. And then, decades later, something extraordinary happened. In the early 2000s, advances in forensic science gave investigators new hope. DNA testing, once crude, now precise, offered the chance to extract evidence from items that had been useless for years. The FBI reopened the case files. Tylenol bottles from 1982, carefully preserved, were tested. Ransom letters were reanalyzed. Items that had sat in storage for decades were scrutinized with technology no one had dreamed of back then. And suddenly, faint traces began to emerge. James William Lewis's name surfaced again. The man who had written the ransom letter all those years ago was questioned once more. He denied everything, as he always had. But new forensic analysis suggested his fingerprints may have been closer to the crime than anyone realized. The FBI launched raids on his home. Computers were seized. Files were combed through. Investigators wanted to know, was this man not just an opportunist, but the original killer hiding in plain sight all along? And yet, even as suspicion circled him once more, the case remained elusive. There was no smoking gun, no undeniable proof, just shadows. Some investigators began to whisper darker theories. What if this wasn't the work of one man at all? What if the Tylenol murders were part of something bigger? An experiment, a test, perhaps even an act of domestic terrorism. The idea seemed far-fetched. But then again, 7 random deaths had brought an entire nation to its knees. If fear was the goal, it had succeeded beyond imagination. The Tylenol murders remain unsolved to this day. But in recent years, secret files have emerged from archives, pointing to names long forgotten, suspects never revealed to the public, and chilling details buried deep within case reports. Files that suggest the truth may not only have been overlooked, but intentionally hidden. What was in those files? Why were they buried for so long? And could they finally point to the real identity of the Tylenol killer? The answers and the disturbing revelations will be uncovered in Part 3. The Tylenol murders had haunted America for decades. Families were broken, trust was shattered, and investigators had spent years chasing shadows. By the early 2000s, the case was considered all but frozen in time, an unsolved relic of the past. A story whispered in true crime circles, a case study in police academies, but little more. And then, everything changed. A quiet discovery in an old case file would ignite a firestorm. A discovery that didn't just reopen the case. It shifted the balance of power entirely. When the FBI began digitizing old archives, a series of confidential memos and case notes resurfaced. These weren't public documents. They had been buried in restricted folders, unseen for decades. Among them were references to suspects never revealed to the public. Notes about interviews that had been cut short. Leads that had been quietly dropped without explanation. Why had these details been hidden? Who had chosen to suppress them? And most importantly, what did they reveal about the killer? Buried in those files were names that had never been linked to the case in the media. One was a former Johnson & Johnson employee with a history of erratic behavior and access to distribution routes. Another was a local man with a record of chemical purchases matching potassium cyanide. These men had been questioned briefly, then released. Their files marked with notes like, "No further action required," or "Insufficient evidence." But reading them now, investigators saw something chilling. Patterns, overlaps, missed connections. It was as if the case had been deliberately narrowed to focus only on one man, James William Lewis. Was Lewis a convenient scapegoat? A distraction to keep the public satisfied while other leads were buried? This was the major power shift. For years, Johnson & Johnson had been praised for its swift, decisive recall. The company was seen as the hero in the tragedy, saving lives, rebuilding trust, pioneering tamper-proof packaging. But the hidden files suggested another possibility. Was it possible that corporate pressure had influenced the investigation? That certain suspects, certain leads, had been quietly pushed aside to protect reputations, to save a brand, to avoid panic spiraling even further? It was a theory investigators whispered about in private. Never proven, never confirmed, but impossible to ignore. And if true, it meant the killer had slipped away not just because he was clever, but because forces bigger than him had allowed the trail to go cold. Meanwhile, the shadow of James William Lewis loomed large once again. In the mid-2000s, federal agents raided his home. Computers, letters, notes, everything was seized. Investigators hoped DNA or handwriting analysis would finally tie him to the poison bottles. But once again, the evidence wasn't enough. Lewis denied involvement until his death in 2023, insisting he was framed, insisting he had merely taken advantage of the chaos. If he wasn't the killer, then he was the most unlucky man in America, forever chained to a crime he didn't commit. But if he was the killer, then he had gotten away with one of the most infamous mass murders in U.S. history. The resurfaced files reignited something else too: the voices of the victims' families. They demanded transparency. They wanted every page, every buried lead, every sealed memo released to the public. For them, this wasn't about corporate image or federal procedure. This was about the truth, about justice for Mary Kellerman, for Adam Janis, for Stanley and Teresa, and the 3 other lives stolen by poison in a bottle. The families refused to let the case fade again. And in their persistence, they forced investigators to confront the possibility that the real killer might never have been truly pursued. Then came a breakthrough, or what seemed like one. New forensic testing revealed partial DNA profiles from evidence connected to the case. It wasn't enough for a full match, but enough to compare against suspects. The results ruled out several men who had once been considered. But it also introduced new uncertainty, because the DNA didn't match James William Lewis. This revelation tilted the balance again. For decades, Lewis had been the central figure, the face of suspicion. Now, science suggested he wasn't the one. So who was? The DNA hinted at a different direction. Some investigators began to suspect that the Tylenol killer might have been a local Chicago resident, someone who lived close to the victims, someone who could move unnoticed between stores. And then came the most chilling thought of all. What if the killer had blended back into everyday life? What if he had been someone ordinary? A neighbor, a coworker, the man standing in line at the pharmacy, and no one had ever realized. The banality of that possibility was terrifying. 40 years have passed since that September morning in 1982. The Tylenol murders remain unsolved, but the hidden files, the partial DNA, and the suppressed suspects all point to one conclusion: the truth has been closer than anyone realized. In fact, one name buried deep in those files may hold the key to the entire case. A name investigators once dismissed. A name that resurfaced years later under strange circumstances. A name that could change everything. But who was it? And why was this person's file marked confidential and locked away for decades? That's what we'll uncover in Part 4, the conclusion to the Tylenol murders. For more than 40 years, the Tylenol murders have lingered in the shadows of American memory. A scar that never quite healed. 7 lives stolen in a single week. A nation terrified of its own medicine cabinets. An investigation that became one of the most infamous unsolved cases in U.S. history. But sometimes, closure isn't about catching a single person. Sometimes, it's about the truth that rises from tragedy and the power of what we choose to do with it. When the suppressed case files were re-examined, one name stood out. Not because it screamed guilt, not because it came with a signed confession, but because of how carefully it had been hidden. The man was Roger Arnold, a 48-year-old dock worker in Chicago at the time of the murders. Arnold had a background in chemistry, a fascination with cyanide, and lived near several of the pharmacies where the poison bottles had been discovered. He was questioned early in the case, and for a moment, detectives thought they had their man. But Arnold was eventually released. The official story was that the evidence wasn't strong enough. Unofficially, the files revealed concerns that focusing too hard on Arnold, a local man with ties to victims, might unleash even greater panic. So the spotlight shifted, away from him, toward James William Lewis, and Roger Arnold's name slipped into obscurity. But the story didn't end there. After being publicly named as a person of interest in news coverage, Arnold's life fell apart. He lost his job. His marriage crumbled. Neighbors turned on him. In a fit of paranoia and rage, Arnold murdered a completely innocent man, a bartender he mistakenly believed had spread rumors about his involvement in the Tylenol case. He was convicted and spent years behind bars for that murder. The irony was brutal. Whether or not he had poisoned Tylenol capsules, Roger Arnold had still taken a life. In many ways, his own downfall mirrored the destruction left in the wake of 1982. When Arnold died in 2008, many wondered if the grave had swallowed the real killer. But here's the haunting truth. To this day, no one has ever been convicted of the Tylenol murders themselves. James William Lewis, the extortionist who seemed forever tied to the case, died in 2023, still proclaiming his innocence. Roger Arnold went to prison for another man's murder, never officially charged with the Tylenol killings. The case is technically still open, still unsolved, still a mystery, and yet, in an unexpected way, justice was served. Not in the courtroom, not through a jury's verdict, but through transformation. Because the Tylenol murders forced an entire nation, an entire world, to change. Before 1982, tamper-proof packaging barely existed. Medicine bottles could be opened and resealed without detection. Food and drinks were often sold with nothing more than a twist-off cap. The Tylenol murders changed that forever. The tragedy led to the Tylenol Bill of 1983, making product tampering a federal offense. Manufacturers across the world adopted triple-sealed packaging, blister packs, and safety caps. Pharmacies tightened security. Consumers became vigilant. And from that point on, every time you twist a cap and hear the crack of a safety seal, every time you peel back foil on a medicine bottle, you are witnessing the legacy of the Tylenol victims. Their deaths saved countless lives. For the families of Mary Kellerman, Adam Janis, Stanley and Teresa Janis, and the others, nothing could bring back their loved ones. But many of them found purpose in advocacy, demanding stricter consumer safety laws, pressing for transparency in investigations, and keeping the story alive so the victims would never be forgotten. Their grief became a warning. Their pain became protection. In the end, their voices ensured that the Tylenol murders were not just a story of loss, but of transformation. The Tylenol murders remain one of the darkest unsolved crimes in American history. And yet, unlike so many cold cases, this story didn't end in silence. It ended in revolution. It reshaped how we shop, how we trust, how we protect ourselves and each other. It reminded us that even in moments of chaos and cruelty, humanity has the power to rise, adapt, and safeguard the future. So what do we take from all this? That evil exists, yes. That one person's cruelty can ripple across an entire nation, yes. But also, that tragedy can lead to transformation. The Tylenol victims did not die in vain. Their story is written into every pharmacy aisle, every medicine cabinet, every sealed package that protects our families today. And that is where justice lies. Not in a single name or a single conviction, but in a world forever changed by their loss. The Tylenol murders may never have an official killer, never have a courtroom verdict. But the victims left behind a legacy stronger than fear, stronger than death itself. Every seal you break open is proof that their story mattered. Proof that sometimes justice isn't about punishment, it's about protection. And perhaps that is the ultimate conclusion. Evil will always try to find a way in, but humanity will always fight back, seal by seal, life by life. Because justice isn't just about catching the guilty. Justice is about protecting the innocent. And in that sense, justice has been served.